Good evening and welcome to the RSA's Great Room, and also welcome to those of you who are online. I'm Jennifer Johnston. I'm an opera singer, creative consultant and former barrister, and I'm your chair for this evening. And I'm joined by a panel of exceptional women to discuss what bold actions are needed to realise true gender equality. So tonight we're going to look at that in a form of a discussion, followed by questions from the floor and online. If you have any questions, there are ways of asking them that will feed through to me at the end, and then we'll hopefully wrap this up by 7 p.m. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce each of the three amazing women sat next to me. First of all, Sophia Smith Galer, author and journalist. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Well, I am that. I'm an author and a journalist. I was a journalist for the BBC and Vice News, and then I went independent. I pioneered TikTok journalism in the UK, and I've now founded my own company to help people tell stories like how I do.
I, Stephanie Boyce.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm Stephanie Boyce, the former president of the Law Society of England and Wales, and of course the Law Society is the professional body for over 200,000 solicitors in England and Wales. And I made history in March 2021 when I became the 177th, the sixth female, the first black and the first person of colour to occupy that position.
Woo!
And Rachel Williams.
Hello, I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Manager for the charity Women in Sport. We are the oldest charity set up to promote the rights of women and girls in sport. We focus mostly on the grassroots, but we do dabble in elite as well. And for those of you who signed up when Stephanie Hilborne was on the speakers list, she is our chief executive. Unfortunately, she's had a family bereavement. So I'm a last-minute substitute, and if you don't like terrible sports puns, this is going to be a really long hour for you. I'm sorry.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So we're going to dive straight in, and the first question we're going to look at is, despite decades of effort, studies show that many workplace challenges and barriers faced by women since the 1990s have persisted and still exist today. Why has progress stalled, and what cultural shifts and bold policies do we need to push change forwards? Turning to you first, Sophia.
But it's such a big question, and I mean, on the one hand, it's not totally stalled. Like, I do feel, generally speaking, about pretty much everything in life, I always feel really optimistic, perhaps foolishly so. I don't feel like it's totally bad. I agree with you that, you know, a lot of things need improving, and it's been particularly distressing given during my reporting career, I did do a lot on health and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And certainly, if you're looking at the United States, there's been a reversal there. And it's disturbing how many countries pursue the United States. That's why it's of great concern, because the worry will be rollback elsewhere around the world when we've actually made huge strides when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights and justice. The second part of your question, remind me. What can we do about it?
What can we do about it? How do we push change forwards?
I think each of us here will think about this broadly and also think in our own industries. And I think something that's been really challenging for me is that I straddle two different industries at once. So I bear witness to what's going on in traditional journalism and what's going on with the media industry, which frankly, in the old way is in decline. And then I straddle the other side, which is this nascent, novel form of sharing content and information using social media and new ways in which we learn and communicate around the world. And on the one hand, if I look at the media world, I very much see in the UK, there are far fewer women than men who are editors in newsrooms. I have been in newsrooms myself where I can see it's really clear that gender diversity and pretty much every diversity has actually been ignored. And then on the other hand, I'm in this other space where actually I see way more women than I do men. As a content creator, I think if we think about a lot of our online lives, I see far more women than men. It's a place where we simultaneously have a lot of power, but also where people who make social media content or who are called or even self-describe as influencers will be seen as doing work that is lesser than other fields, something that I believe is very strongly connected to sexism. So I guess in the different fields that I'm in, I certainly see a lot of progress that needs to be made. And it's not so much about giving women the confidence to occupy these positions. We have the confidence, we want to be in them. It's that we're not necessarily being hired into them
or glass ceiling.
Or given space, yeah.
Stephanie, what's your perspective from the legal professions in the United Kingdom, would you say?
Well, I mean, absolutely. Firstly, the fact that, you know, we've all got a part to play in getting that equality that we're absolutely striving for. You know, our allies in terms of, you know, we're all agents for change, and have to acknowledge the role that we can each play in achieving that equity that we desire. I mean, certainly in the legal profession, we've made great strides since the 1990s in terms of the diversity of the profession, but indeed, women are now in the majority in the legal profession at entry, and indeed as practicing members. And I think doctors recently have achieved women in the majority for the first time. The difficulty, of course, is that when you get to the middle parts of our profession and the senior parts of our profession, that's where the numbers are dropping off. And if you look at, in terms of those in private practice who make up partnership, women are just not getting through in the numbers. They're not making it through to the senior decision-making parts of our profession. You know, for instance, you would have heard me said, you know, 177, 6 female. I think we've had 7 female presidents at the moment as the Law Society celebrates its 200th year anniversary. There are lots of things that have to change. We as a society have to change. We have, you know, stereotypes about who we think makes good decision makers, who makes good leaders. Anybody who's heard me talk will know that I have a real bee in my bonnet in terms of people who we put in positions of power and influence. And they don't always look like us, you know, women. And if you embed intersectionality into that, you know, whether it's a disability, a sexuality, religion, you know, female, whatever, those barriers are even more entrenched. So we as a society have to decide what type of society do we want. We, the legal profession, say we absolutely have to be a profession that reflects the society we seek to serve. And whilst the legal profession does a bit better compared to some other professions, we're still not where we need to be.
Do you think that the legal profession does that partly because it's a merit-based system? Or is it that old patriarchal structures still do exist, would you say?
I think there's a combination of that. You know, I have an issue around merit. You know, I was sat on a panel last week where somebody said, you know, I'm all for EDI or DEI, whichever you choose to term it, but I believe that, you know, people should be appointed on merit. The difficulty, of course, that I have with merit is that merit means different things to different people, and it doesn't necessarily mean equal or equitable. And that is, you know, so if you take the solicitor profession, for instance, we've done really, really well when it comes to social mobility. That was one of my focus areas for presidency. But some 23% of us are privately educated. You know, and again, going back to that societal issue, if you look at our last however many prime ministers, they've all gone to a certain school and a certain university. So again, I come back to that whole societal issue and what is it that we want as a society. And if the only people we're pushing forward look a certain way, sound a certain way, then we're never going to get to where we need to get to until we change that mindset.
Mindset is a very big part of sport, particularly looking at the progression from grassroots up to professional sport. What would you say in terms of what you've heard of other industries, in terms of the progress you feel sport's making?
I feel like a lot of the same patterns that are in any other industry are reflected within sport. You know, exactly what Stephanie has described. You see in sport leadership, particularly in coaching. You know, if you think of coaching, You see loads and loads and loads of female coaches coaching grassroots teams, coaching school teams, coaching kids teams, not to sound dismissive. But then look at that as it goes up. How many female coaches are there in the Premier League? How many female coaches are there in the Women's Super League? How many female coaches are there in Premiership Women's Rugby, which is the elite Women's Rugby Union League? None in the latter case. None in the case of the Premier League, and just a handful in the WSL. So that pattern completely reflects. And to go back to your original question, a lot of that is about the culture. You know, yes, we have made really big strides, and there are amazing women throughout sport now in those leadership roles, whether they're CEOs, chairs of boards. Serena Wiegmann, you know, I'm going to have to get the name in the first 5 minutes of speaking. It's the law when you come to one of these events and you work in sport. But the culture that operates around these women, they've in many ways succeeded despite that culture, not because of it. You know, they're the ones who've clawed their way up to the top. They're the ones that have taken their sledgehammers to the glass ceiling. And that's incredible, but that's not the way that you build a sustainable female workforce in any sense, within sport or anywhere else. And that's the bit that needs to change across the piece, you know, until within sport, and I suspect within many other professions, until we can get to a place where women are actually welcome, like meaningfully welcome, and given the same opportunities as their male colleagues, then, you know, we're going to keep perpetuating this system where women are underrepresented.
So, Stephanie, taking your point that really we're looking for industry at large, the working life of our nation, to really be a mirror on society. Given that women demonstrate different qualities in leadership than men, so adaptability, innovation, but often struggle to break the glass ceiling, how can we improve leadership structures in terms of practical steps that those listening could take in their own organisations to encourage women through to the very top levels?
One of the things I hear primarily is that actually transparency is an issue. That for lots of individuals, women, that they don't know where the barriers are, because sometimes, you know, they're unseen. Some of those barriers, they don't know where the promotion lies. One organisation that I've been working with, initially, it was we don't even know how to get onto some of the training courses. Because it's not very transparent, it's not very open. The reality is we are decision makers, we're leaders, we're politicians, we're innovators, you know, we're everything and more. But the opportunity, of course, to put the best version of ourselves forward is not always there for us to take. For a number of systemic barriers that I talk about, discriminatory policies that hold us back, and not only in this country, but of course globally. You know, if you happen to be a woman, you are still in some countries around the world, you do not exercise the same rights of citizenship as your male colleague. You are denied an education, you know, an inability to raise your voice in public, to dress a certain way, whom you can speak to, and so forth. But we know that actually, given the opportunity, we've got the same, if not, dare I say it, if not more attributes better at what we can do and what we can bring to the table. Because we know that actually, you know, when you've got diverse voices in the room, it makes a difference. It brings a richness and a value to the conversation, to the experience, to the productivity. Lost my voice there. But to the productivity, all of those things. But we need to be able to see where those promotion lines lie, where access lies, where training lies, and data. If you're going to collect data, do something with it.
Interesting, because that relates directly into your point about social media, and it's the equality that comes from anybody having a voice if they want it, if they take that mantle up. What would you say to encourage women to speak more openly on social media about their experiences in workplaces?
That's an interesting thing to talk about, because we can't speak on social media and there be no consequence. So primarily in terms of online harassment and just by my gender, if I post online, I am, before I even open my mouth, I'm more likely to experience online harassment than a male colleague trying to do exactly the same job. How good are platforms in protecting people like me? How good are platforms at protecting people of colour when they are targeted with harassment and abuse? I mean, time and again, they've proven to fall really short of protecting us. That being said, yeah, in the work I do, I try and, I think if you can't beat them, join them. I think that the impact of online harassment is often that it pushes women offline. I will never forget an interview that I did with one of the sort of preeminent researchers about sex education and the impact and influence of policy in the United States. And when I contacted her to interview her about her work, she had no digital footprint. It was very hard to find any information about her online other than what I gleaned from her published research. And it's because she's been pushed offline. This is someone whose work is vital and should be heard all the time, but especially under a Trump administration, who almost definitely will roll back sex education in the US. And she said, I was targeted with so much harassment that everything is completely shut down. So the minute we make platforms safer for us to be vocal on, the minute that people like me and colleagues of mine can share how we deal with it, in spite of these platforms not pulling their weight, how do I deal with it? What contingency plans do I have? What safety features do I enact to make sure I am safe when I am vocal? I think that will be something that's very helpful. But to your point about transparency, pay equality. I know of journalism organisations that are not remotely transparent about whether that is something that they keep an eye on internally, and if you thought there could be an issue, who you would report that to and where that report would go. The minute any of that process doesn't become transparent as you describe, it's going to put women off doing it. So I think that in particular.
Yeah, interesting, because both of those points directly relate into sport very clearly. I think, Rachel, pay disparities in sport remain stark. How do we challenge this when also women in sport are faced with such a lot of abuse online?
Yeah, we challenge it with bravery, I think, is the answer to that. I mean, women's sport at the moment is at such an interesting position because on the one hand, it's getting coverage and attention and attracting money in a way that it absolutely never has before. But compare it with men's sport and it's still, almost a rounding error on a spreadsheet, to be completely honest. And some of the pay disparity is mind-boggling. I'm not going to talk about football because that point makes itself, frankly. But if you look at things like, apologies to any cricket fans in the room who think this is heresy, but if you look at something like the 100 in cricket, which for those of you who don't know is a new tournament that was set up specifically with the mantra of one club, with a men's team and a women's team, and we treat everyone exactly the same. Of course they don't. The women's match is always played first on match days. They've recently put up the pay bands so that women are still paid significantly less than men, and the top men are paid a lot more than they were. And cricket, to be fair, I don't want to spend the whole night slagging off various sports, and cricket are doing some really great stuff for women and girls. The argument that we always get back when we put this to sport is, but it's the men's sport that brings in the money. Well, flip that though. If you were actually properly investing in your women's game, wouldn't it be the women's game that was also be bringing in the money? If you were marketing your women's teams in the same way, to the same extent as you market your men's teams, what impact would that have? Maybe you could try and find out and see what happens. And we are seeing some positive change for sure. I mean, I think in sport particularly, the fact we're even having these debates is really positive. The fact that it's even being entertained that female sports people should be paid in a lot of sports is a huge development, and clearly it's something that isn't happening in all sports. But yeah, it's something that we just have to keep going at, and I think in sport as in life, I suspect you just have to remind people that you're not going away. Like, we're not going to stop asking for this stuff just because it's inconvenient for them. And we are seeing progress, and we will see more if we just keep going at it.
I have a point. Can I just say, when you said that they're not investing in marketing the teams, I think it's very interesting that I've only ever read her name. I don't know how to pronounce it. Ilona Ma, who's the amazing US rugby player who's playing for the Bristol Bears. Did she have marketing paid into her? Or did she effectively market herself to get to this position? So that's what we're often finding. Not only are women having to bring bravery when they come online, they're essentially having to really market themselves to get the same kind of recognition and a lot of money. How much money is that team getting now? The amount of tickets that people are buying for games has really shot up because of her work. So the investment into her is kind of delayed. She had to do so much first in order to get it. But now, of course, she's reaping the reward.
I think the reaping the rewards point is an important one, though, because without the initial pay, it's then quite difficult for women to invest into a career in a way that a man might if he was very highly paid. And I think that women have to spend a lot more to get a lot further in a lot of industries, not just in sport. And I think the reflection of women actually in print media can be very detrimental to that process, interestingly. So there's an interesting sort of dichotomy between social media and print media there too. Would you agree with that, Rachel?
Yeah, I think so. And I think thinking about sports sponsorship more generally, it's really interesting when you see some of the brands who are really keen to get involved in women's sport, and particularly with individual sports women. So it's a few years ago now, but there was a brilliant, Gucci did a campaign with Leah Williamson, the England footballer. And you've seen Il Maquillage, the makeup brand, have done a lot of stuff with Arsenal women. And it's interesting that those brands are kind of makeup and clothes. They're not the brands that you would think, the equivalent brands would not be investing in men's sport. And I think there's a really interesting thing there as to what about these women that we're valuing? And absolutely no shade on them whatsoever for taking those deals. And the Leah Williamson Gucci one was amazing. It's worth looking at the photos of those. But I just don't think we would be treating males, well, sportsmen, in that way. Their sponsorship will all come from the big sports brands. Their sponsorship will come from whoever makes their £4,000 shoes, or whatever it happens to be.
Stephanie, you wanted to make a point?
Well, I was going to make 2 points, and that's around that societal shift. One of the reasons why some of this has been able to or allowed to happen is because actually, until we as a society start to actually speak up for and demand for the equality in pay, and I know that some of the women's football team have done a lot better in terms of some of the sponsorship deals, but like you say, no way on par as with their male colleagues. And that's going to take a real movement, as with the goalkeeper, whose name I forget, but where we saw with the goalkeeper, with the shirt and so forth. But the other issue, of course, is around money. One of the things that we hear lots around EDI, as I call it, is the lack of budget or money that is set aside to deal with it. And lots of this, and lots of what we're asking for, of course, needs investment. And so people who want to do it on the cheap, or people who say, well, we've got, you want to do EDI, you want a woman speaker to come along, International Women's Day, month, whatever, and let me say I'm a woman 365 days a year, and then they'll say, but we haven't got any money to pay you. And that's the issue. And of course, there are lots of women out there and lots of people out there who will do things for free, because obviously we want the exposure, we want to get the message out. But, it's going to take that shift and that investment where we're going to see real measurable change.
This is a question for all three of you in some ways, but you'll probably answer it differently because of your perspectives. How much does education count right from early years up in this whole process of, recreating society in a way? Sophia?
We know that it's in one of the most underfunded subjects in school, which is relationships, and then relationships and sex education, where you actually get your earliest lessons on self-esteem. That's what those lessons actually look like in really early years. They're not about doing anything with your body, someone else's body. It's all just kind of, this is you. This is what makes you special. Everyone is special. It focuses around that. So I always believe that a grounding in good, solid self-esteem education can last someone a lifetime. It sort of offers them the protective film that can end up not only giving them the confidence to push forward in the future, but when they inevitably face rejection or indeed marginalisation, that they don't let it completely destroy them and that they push through it. Something that troubles me in the education space, however, would be, it's still linked to how under-supported this entire space is. When I was at Boyce, I did a Freedom of Information investigation that revealed that the government of the time had lied about how much money it was investing into teacher training for sex ed. But we now end up with these stats, and like a new report comes out every 6 months that says the same thing. But something like how at university, I remember in one survey that we were kind of going too far in talking about gender equality the whole time, that we were going too far in discussing this as an important issue, and it was men who thought that more than women. So something has to happen in the education space to challenge that mentality, because that's not because people aren't talking about gender equality. They are. Something's going wrong where our conversations around gender equality end up excluding a portion of the general public when they need to be included.
Stephanie?
So I think it's the Centre for Social Justice who recently published a report called Lost Boys, where it talks about that from school right through, that boys lag behind girls. But something happens when you get into the workplace where women then fall behind, especially when you get to, as I said before, the senior decision parts of industries. But the education piece for me doesn't just start in schools, it starts in our homes, it starts in our communities, our villages. There are still conversations going on in some families that actually, girls, women are not equal, they're not as good enough. And those conversations need to shift because, and we've all heard this where, you've got a job description and a man will look at the job description, there's 10 things there, perhaps he can do one, and he'll apply for the job. A woman will sit there and, really stress over the fact, can I say, not me though, but can I do all 9 things before applying? And that's the difficulty, which then takes me back to the point that I was making earlier about that shift in mindset as to what a leader should sound like and should look like. We, the public, still have an issue in this country with class. Whether or not we wish to admit it or not, we still have an issue with class. And when I think about my trajectory, it took me, for people who don't know, it took me 4 attempts to become president of the Law Society. And for those people who told me that I would never do it, never in our lifetime would we see an ethnic minority become president, go home and rest, you're embarrassing yourself, we need someone who can converse with government, all of those things. And, my backstory is, first generation British, coming from a single parent household from a council estate. I was not privately educated. I did not go, my first degree was not at a Russell Group university. So all of those barriers being smashed in the legal profession. But it was that confidence and knowing my own self-worth, which takes me back to the job description. And, it's about that confidence. But some of that is embedded in stereotypes because, from a young age, I felt my domestic servitude terribly. I can't cook, I'm best out of the kitchen. But, all of those things where, my step-siblings could go out my brothers could go out and do whatever, but me and my stepsister were expected to stay in the house and learn to clean and cook and so forth. And that impacts, as you get older, on that confidence. And, the question I'm asked all the time is around imposter syndrome. I am rarely asked that question by men. In fact, I don't think I've ever been asked that question by men.
Traditional structures are particularly notable, I would say, in football, and particularly I come from Liverpool, which is a city that still holds on to its traditional structures in households in particular. How much work is having to go into at grassroots level to try and dislodge some of those preconceptions?
So much work, and we're not there yet. So Women in Sport did some really, really interesting research last year, looking specifically at the attitudes of primary school age boys when it came to women's sport and the relationship with sport and their female peers. And what that showed basically was that boys are arriving at school age 5 already thinking that sport is their birthright and that the girls in their class are rubbish at it, and that's just the way it is. And when we think about the way that parents talk about their kids at that age, sporty comes up loads for boys, whereas kind comes up loads for girls, all of that kind of stuff. So, gender stereotyping is absolutely at the heart of sport at the moment. We see it reflected in all kinds of ways. Hands up, women in the room, how many of you were allowed to play rugby at school? Yeah, how many of the women in the room were allowed to play football at school? That's pretty good.
Wow.
That's pretty good. Of the men in the room, how many of you played netball in school or rounders? Okay, some rounders. And at the end of the day, this is why we have some of the struggles that we have in sport across the piece. It's one of the reasons why there are so few female leaders in sport is the impact of that early gender stereotyping. Exactly as you were saying, if you do a quick Google search with the word sports coach, the image that comes up is a white man with a whistle around his neck. And sure, that's one type of coach, but it's not the only one. So that's certainly one of the major problems we have within sport and within, trying to change the system in sport. And the other point, if I may, just really quickly on education. Again, the women in the room, put your hand up if you had a really good experience in PE. Oh, look, one, that's pretty good. This is still the case for too many girls today. So many of us, myself very much included, our relationship with sport is forged in PE. And for, clearly for pretty much everyone in the room, we're having really rubbish experiences. And for some of us, again, thankfully myself included, we can get over that in later life. But a lot of women don't. And a lot of them are put off by the fact that either they were, shouted at by a PE teacher who couldn't understand that they were on their period and therefore maybe didn't feel amazing and want to run around today, or they were just completely ignored in PE lessons. And unfortunately, there's very little in between. So, picking up on Sophia's point around teacher training, this is another area that really needs to be looked at. I say this as a very, very proud daughter of a primary school teacher. But, the average amount of training that a primary school teacher who is going to have to teach PE to the youngest kids gets in a full year of teacher training is 4 to 6 hours. And that's clearly just insane, because it's not like any other subject. You can be an amazing maths, science, English teacher and be terrible at teaching PE because no one's told you how to do it, and you can't transfer all of the skills that you have from your amazing classroom practice to the hockey pitch or wherever it happens to be. So yes, we need to tackle stereotyping for sure, and school sport is a big part of that. And at the moment, for girls, we're just getting school sport wrong.
And also some of it's language, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I think that actually applies in other contexts, whether it be journalism or law as well, that language has such an important role to play. And if language isn't consistent across the country and not applied consistently, then another reason why transparency and stability then becomes really difficult to achieve. Women's professional networks can be very important as a tool in creating change. But so can engaging men as allies. So how do we go about that, Sophia?
I think every man who's come here tonight, I wish survey data was collected on you. Why are you here? What brought you here? What brings you to events like this? And what doesn't bring other men to events like this? I think all of that's really interesting information. There must be a word for it, or someone should make it up, but I constantly think about the data I'd love to have and what it would tell me if I could. So even including data about social media behaviour, because I'm very confident that there are gender differences in how we behave online, because I see it almost in the analytics that I have on my social media feeds, and I want to know more. And I think some of that would inform us more on why do men and women feel compelled to say or comment or reply or share in certain ways. This is currently data that, frankly, the platforms have if they only gave it to us. So I'd be very interested in that. But in terms of men becoming better allies, I think there are many opportunities over the course of your professional career where a woman colleague will ask you something, and if you weren't being an ally, you'd say no, and if you were being an ally, you'd say yes. One of those is pay transparency. There are many other things as well, I'm sure. If everyone, there's something that we should all think about here, and even in the Q&A afterwards, I'd encourage you to say, share with the rest of the group how else men can be allies, because that's always the thing that comes up in these kind of conversations, but that can't be the only question. That can't be the only way. There must be other ways as well. I'm thinking especially about people who don't have hiring power. It's pretty obvious what people with hiring power have to start doing more of. But it's that actually those, when you said the middle and lower, I think it's also about figuring out what needs to happen there.
Rachel, I know that sport has done quite a lot of work in this field.
Yeah, and again, we've still got plenty more work to do. So I think, it has to start in school, and I would really, really love to be in a position, if Women in Sport reran our mini allies research, as we optimistically called it, 10 years in the future, then the results would be completely different, and little boys would be saying, yeah, of course the girl classmates can play football, and of course they can play it as well as I can, that's totally fine. So for me, we have to think of allyship as a whole life societal thing. It's not just, what Andy Murray does with his platform, although that's fantastic. But coming back to Andy Murray, I do think when it comes to male allyship, which is a term I absolutely hate, I have to say, and I know a lot of male allies absolutely hate it as well, but I don't know what the better alternative is, so I'm going to keep using it. I think we do have to really kind of lift up the men that are doing it well. I mentioned Andy Murray, of course. There's that really famous clip of him challenging a journalist who basically forgot about the existence of Serena Williams. We saw it, any cycling fans in the room, we saw it this weekend again when you had the greatest male cyclist in the world having to remind a journalist that female cycling exists this weekend as well. You see it throughout sport, and the men who are actually being the ones who are sat in front of that camera going, excuse me, no, you're wrong. I didn't do this first. Several women have done it before me. I do think we do need to be giving those men, amplifying their voices, in the same way that we might want to tramp down other voices in this debate. I also think, and the reason why allyship slightly makes me twitch, we do need to make sure that it's actually meaning something, though. I think particularly in sport, a lot of men who call themselves allies actually mean that occasionally they watch a WSL match. And it's like, no, that's not it. That's just watching a football game. That's not allyship. It has to be deeper than that. We have to kind of, again, as a society, kind of reconceptualize, I guess, certain aspects of what allyship is. Because certainly in sport, and I'm sure not uniquely in sport at the moment, a lot of it is very performative and it's window dressing. Shout out the good guys and tell the inauthentic ones to shut up, basically.
Stephanie?
I guess the only thing I would add is that absolutely we can't have this discussion in the absence of male allies. They've got to be included. And I think there have been some spaces where men have perhaps felt excluded from those conversations. But if we want to shift the dial, and, I keep thinking back to, the Beijing Declaration, 30 years ago when we were talking about accelerated action on gender inequality, and 30 years later, we're still talking, about the same thing because we haven't achieved that gender parity. And, thinking about how many years, 2158, I think it is, projected until that may be a reality. Well, none of us are going to be here for then, but what's the messaging? What's, the messaging, the story, the legacy that actually we're imparting to the future generation of leaders, female leaders, getting women into that space, the decision-making space. And we've got more women in politics and so forth, and in lots of spaces. But like we spoke about, it shouldn't just be a one-off. It should be that actually from the time that you are old enough and you aspire enough that actually you can see yourself at the top of, whether... Because one of the things I've written about lots is about the way that we treat women leaders. I have a real thing about the fact that we seem to treat women leaders harsher than we do men. And, you know, how quickly we are as a society willing to just chop. And all these things, you know, how many times we've sat, in front of the TV, whether, you know, wherever, and, you know, there'll be like a female newsreader on and somebody will say, you know, or, you know, what's gone on at the BBC with equal pay, with, you know, ageism as an issue as well. You know, all of those things that seem to affect women, and of course menopause. We're talking lots and lots about menopause. But, you know, it is a condition, that you go through. And, you know, it's, when I think about my own experience with it, you know, and having to explain to the doctor, you just think, am I just, you know, in a parallel universe having to explain what my body or what I think my body is going through? And one wonders that, you know, maybe if it was on the other shoe, whether or not, you know, menopause, whilst we're talking lots about it now, whether or not there would have been greater adoption of medicine and so forth for it, and the condition, or not the condition or menopause treated differently if it happened on the same scale to men. And I know men do go through a male menopause, but it's just the effect that it has on your body, your ability to think sometimes, which can be quite impactful.
And also debilitating, and also affects every woman on the planet.
Yeah.
So it's ironic that we're still having to fight for the right medical care and the right support. Thank you very much, ladies. I would like to open out the floor to questions. I hope that somebody's got a microphone, yeah, and also the iPad for me, which might update me about any questions from online. The gentleman there has his hand raised very high, so go to him first.
Thank you. I do wonder if what we're dealing with here is the gender equivalent of the famous West Lothian question, which is, in the same way, why do Scottish MPs get to vote on what goes on in England? Why do so many decisions about what gets done in women's lives get decided by men in men's committees or men's politics? So what if some of these bodies actually had full women panels in whatever area they were, and they were allocated the budgets that you were talking about simply to allocate for things that worked for them, rather than have to put it to a man to say, is this all right with you? And I mean, fundamentally, that's where I think some of these decisions are being made in a very skewed way.
Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, obviously very much in favour of more female leaders, for sure. And, you know, our research that we've done a few years ago showed that a 50-50 senior team actually has the sort of the best culture and makes the fairest decisions. But, you know, I don't think it's any coincidence that certainly in sports, that many of the sports who are doing the best for women, for investment, for participation and all the rest of it, do have female leaders. That's definitely not coincidence. And I think this is certainly true of sport, and I'm sure it's true of the law and journalism as well. One of the reasons why having women in positions of power, whether it's in sort of all-female teams or not, is that it's that lived experience piece. You know, it's actually having someone who just fundamentally understands what the problem is, and that's definitely something that having more women in those positions, as I say, whatever the structure is, would definitely help with.
It can even be as small as making sure a woman has the right kit.
Yeah.
The female cyclists from the Olympic team reported that they have actually had physical injury from the saddles of the bikes that they were forced to ride on, to the point where some of them ended up hospitalised because their genital area was so inflamed because they were riding on men's cycles for literally hours and hours and hours a week. So it's not a small issue, this, actually.
No, and it's a funny one, because I often, you know, when I sort of do talks like this, kind of start with the question, if women had been running sport from the beginning, would any women's team in the history of sport have ever played in white shorts? No. And that gets a laugh. But as you say, it actually speaks to a really important issue. And it's the same thing, you know, with kind of sports bras, the fact that they're not part of kit lists for a lot of sports. And like, A sports bra is not an aesthetic choice. It's not about making your boobs look great when you go out and play tennis. It's about making sure that you're not in pain. It's about making sure that you're not damaging tissue for later life in a way that you can't repair. And I think that's sort of where the discussion for kit often sort of feels like it is. Like, oh, well, okay, so we'll give them dark shorts so we can't see if they're on their periods, but that's fine. It's just an aesthetic choice. It's not. It's often about safety, as you say. It's always about comfort. And actually, it's about allowing women to kind of bring their whole selves to the pitch or the court or wherever they happen to be playing in a way that men just get to do.
I think can also be symbolic. I mean, I'm no longer in practice at the bar, but I was saying to Stephanie earlier that my first day on my feet as a barrister in court, which in fact was in the High Court, was the very first day that women were ever allowed to wear trousers as a barrister to appear in court. And in fact, the High Court judge who I was appearing in front of sent his clerk out to check whether I was wearing trousers or not, because he was minded not to let me speak if I was. So interesting how times have changed. Stephanie, would you agree that the law still has a way to go in terms of symbology?
I mean, absolutely. Look, we are a profession that is steeped in tradition. You should perhaps come along to one of these dinners that we do, and then some of the toast and so forth. And I, was very enlightened by some of the things that we did, and I didn't know about until I became president. And I guess the point is, if you don't know about that, if you don't come from that world, it can be quite a shock. And so I guess the point is that, patience and understanding that others have. When you go to, for instance, we still have young people who are coming into the profession who, okay, it's not clothing, but, in terms of knowing which cutlery to use, which, do you go to the right, do you go to the left? And not having people make comments about that, but actually just being a bit more understanding and saying very gently, or you can do it first, and, you just move to the left, or whoever sets the table, or this is the wine glass that you take, or so forth. It's those subtle things that actually, without calling somebody out publicly and making them feel less than, that actually we can, those small incremental steps that we can take that can make a remarkable difference.
Some of that is also to do, I believe, with the equality, in inverted commas, that comes from the use of social media, because that is a place where people can express not just how they're feeling, but also can learn. Would you say that education can be from social media in terms of encouraging young women, particularly from sort of communities that perhaps don't have access to the big lights of London and major structures, in terms of making them feel like they could belong in a place?
Being able to put your message out on social media has been one of the most democratising forces for media diversity. Every day now, people who are increasingly consuming news and information on social media, which are all age demographics. It's not only young people. All age demographics are increasingly getting this content from social media. And frankly, when people are able to elevate themselves and put their own message out there, you see different people. If you go on the BBC or if you go on a major news organisation, it tends to be the kinds of faces that you see and the same kinds of faces that traditional media has always platformed. And of course, the minute you put phones into people's hands and empower them to put their own messages out there, it rapidly changes. And who we can also see in our audiences. So my audience online is almost exactly 50-50. Like, news organisations actually struggle to try and achieve 50-50. They almost always overserve men and underserve women. So, but with social media, I've certainly been able to have a 50-50 audience.
The lady in the green with a microphone.
Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic discussion. You talked about the difficulty of women to access the medium, higher level of leadership. I look at my daughter now, who's just had her second child. And first child, she was able to carry on with her career, managing to rush back from work, pick up her daughter from childcare. But the second child has made it even more difficult because of, the issues around how much it costs, etc. Do you not think that this is a real issue, childcare for women, and this is something that is really, preventing people actually continuing their career in the way that they would like to? And what do you think we could do about that?
Stephanie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm terribly qualified to speak on it. I mean, I don't have, biologically, I don't have children. But, I mean, the maternity penalty, if you like, in terms of that childcare. And this is what's steeped in some of these policies that actually, we need, and we were talking about this behind the scenes in terms of, some of the policies that we had and then they've been withdrawn. There is a real issue around the cost of, there's a real issue around the cost of lots of things, but in terms of childcare, I guess when you were speaking, the one thing that I guess I thought about is that, women bear the brunt of childcare or caring, because, it also filters through to women tend to be carers, whether it's for older children or whether it's for their parents. Women tend to bear the brunt of that. And that's what I mean in terms of the shift from our politicians, in terms of the policies that need to address that. And I know there have been some policies, attempts to address the cost of childcare and, in terms of free childcare and how many hours and so forth. But it doesn't go far enough. And then the other end is the penalty that actually when women take time out, that they are penalised for taking time out to have children. And that's not right, nor should it be that you are penalised for taking time out to do what we are asking people to do, which is to, to have children, to keep our society going and so forth. So absolutely needs to be addressed. And some organisations do it really well with their policies, but there are still not enough that are doing enough, including the government, to address some of those, the maternity penalty, if you like, in terms of those costs.
Lady in the cream.
I wanted to actually ask about what the panel thinks. Sorry, I'm Ulrike Köppel. I just wanted to find out what the panel thinks about the public sector and the private sector, if there are differences. One thing I'm looking at is the glass ceiling index from 2025, just published. And what I'm seeing is that Britain has actually, in the last 7 years, significantly jumped ahead from something like 25th place to the 14th, yeah? Which includes sort of 10 measures, including labor force participation, salaries, paid parental leave, etc. And the other thing in my personal experience is that there's been a lot of sponsorship in the private sector in particular. How effective has that been? In my experiences, it has included a lot of male allies, and then also the sort of intercompany mentoring schemes which the 30% Club ran. I think the 30% Club has essentially actually met its goal, although a lot of the board membership is on a non-executive director basis, yeah. But maybe just on those points.
I think I would answer that by saying statistics aren't always accurate, because they can only take a slice of, they're dependent on the pool that they're asking, firstly, but they also can't possibly cover the entire workforce. And
yes, the
sort of the feedback that if you, regardless of whichever industry you talk to, there is still a way to go. Whilst we've made progress in international terms, that it depends who's doing the statistics as to which other countries we're being compared against.
29 countries. I mean, there's I think the Scandinavian countries
Sure.
are usually top.
But obviously each
France
country has its
ahead.
own policies, and they won't always be consistent either. So I would just caution taking statistics as really reflective of a population's progress.
Sure. I mean, I've also shared my personal experience with sponsorship, and I don't know if anyone else has experienced that.
I think just to add, the FTSE Women Leaders Review 2025 recently published, spoke about, the target to get women on boards, and they're at 40%, 43% against their target of 40% compared to where they were, in 2011. So they've done really, really well. And that sounds really good, but the difficulty is when you look at, in terms of FTSE, FTSE 350, FTSE 100, the pay disparity between men and women is 68%. So, so yes, it depends on lots of things. And then when you look at the gender pay gap, again, that depends on, the industry you're in, the age of the women involved, And also, you know, women work on average 48 days for free, certainly in this country, 48 days for free, you know, ahead of their male counterparts. So you imagine 48 days that we're working for free because of that gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap, lots of people will say, has got better, but it depends who you ask and what industry, because we know that predominantly women make up in the caring sector, but we also know or have an idea as to how poor the pay is in that industry.
I've probably got time for one more question. Lady there in the black with her hand up.
I was going to stand up.
Very enthusiastic. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the conversation, ladies. It's been great. My name's Doreen, and I'm the chief exec of an organisation that works predominantly with young people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And so every week we have about between 50 and 75 young people who come to us, and about 50% of those are girls, which is so unusual. And what I'd like to know is how you would realistically prepare children like them for change in the future. I know that, Sophia, you mentioned social media. A lot of them are on social media, but they're only on LinkedIn. So they're very, very much thoughtful and focused on their aspirations and what they want to do and putting themselves in a position where they can move forward. But, and I know, Stephanie, sorry, I've got to keep looking at the names, terrible with names, that you've mentioned family and how the family influences the young people, and it would be interesting to hear advice from both of you. One thing that you think that could make a difference or start to make a difference in the world of the young people and their aspirations, and helping them to become leaders and to become recognised for their value and what they can offer.
Sophia?
Sorry, it's very long.
No, it's fine.
I think a lot about the pandemic and how it just screwed up so many people's lives, but especially young people's lives. And I think that it doesn't matter what generation we're in, sort of in what timeline, there's always going to be some kind of crisis and some kind of systemic failings that we're pretty much always going to have to contend with. You can't control those. They are outside of your control. You can attempt in your realm of power to try and influence things going on, but ultimately these situations are outside of your control. So how do you handle them? How do you cope with them? And in the moments where you may be rejected time and time again, or fail to achieve an important goal of yours because of these systemic problems, what do you do and who do you turn to? And if you can't champion yourself through those moments, things are going to get really dark. So it has to begin with you, and normally we're all stronger if we have a real life support network around us. But loads of us don't even have that. Loads of us don't even get the chance to have that, in which case the biggest champion in your life is always going to be you before it's anyone else. So you have to champion yourself, no matter what anyone else, what anyone else says, and push through it. And because of the world we live in with social media, we can create our own opportunities more than we could, say, 20 years ago as young people. So if no one is giving you an opportunity, even though you deserve it, make one instead.
Excellent advice. Stephanie?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the things that I say to young people lots is to run your own race, write your own story. Resilience is absolutely an issue, and so is aspiration in this country, especially amongst our young, but our citizens, full stop. You know, and we've all heard the statistics of late as to how many young people are NEET, you know, not in education, employment and training and so forth. But resilience is an absolute key, that going back to what Sophia said, and I forget the exact quotation in the Bible, but, you know, the lesson is not in how many times you got knocked down, it is in how you got up. And for me, you know, I'm an absolute believer that every door is open if you push. You persevere until something happens. And that has been the thread that has permeated throughout my life, and the advice that I would give. And also to tell people, our young people, that we believe in them. You know, I tell my nieces and nephews all the time, you can be anything you set your mind to. And no matter what, I believe in you. And lots of our young people have never heard anyone say, I believe in you.
Rachel? I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Rachel?
Yeah, I feel almost slightly bad now trying to follow up on that and trivialise it. But one of the best ways to build resilience at any age in your life is to play sport.
Yeah.
That would be my advice.
Thank you very much to my amazing panel and to those who asked questions. I'm sorry that we can't possibly answer everybody's questions. I'd also just like to summarise what we've heard tonight. I wrote down some words. I've just written down be your own champion, resilience, transparency, aspiration, investment, perseverance and support. If women have all of those things, we'll get on a lot further and a lot quicker. So everything that you can do within your own spheres of influence to make those things happen, the better it will be for all the women in your life, regardless of who they are. Thank you very much to the RSA for hosting tonight. If anybody would like to make a donation to the RSA, they're very welcome to do so on the website. You can apply to become a fellow on the website. And we look forward to seeing you all here again for another event soon. Thank you.